Western stereotypes of the Ottoman harem are often inspired by stories such as the Arabian Nights. But EbruNews correspondent Carrie Ederer tells us scholars say these tales are a distortion.
A growing area of historical study is challenging old Western stereotypes of the Ottoman harem. It's also shedding new light on the role of women in the Sultan's harem and the contributions they made from inside palace walls.
Adaletini dünyaya göstermeyi nasip etsin.
A new soap opera on the Turkish station Show TV has reignited an old debate. Critics of the show, called Muhteşem Yüzyıl, or Magnificent Century, say it portrays Suleiman the Magnificent in a negative light. Some say the show has given new life to old stereotypes of the Ottoman harem. Stereotypes of the harem as a luxurious suite filled with exotic, scantily clad, powerless women have existed in Hollywood movies and Western imaginations for centuries. But a growing area of literature reveals that Western stereotypes of the harem could not be farther from the truth.
I think it's really important that people pay attention to the history. I mean, I think that the real history of the women of the harem is much more interesting than these stereotypical stories. We have all kinds of women doing different things in the harems. We have to give them credit for the power they played, for the way in which they actually had an impact on the development of the Ottoman Empire.
NYU professor Leslie Pierce wrote a book about the role of women in the Sultan's harem. She says the stereotypes have been perpetuated by accounts of Western male travelers who had no access to the royal harem.
In the 16th century and the 17th century especially, English, French, Italian writers wrote about it. The women are imprisoned, the women are sex slaves of the Sultan, they're waiting for him, they have no power, they're just there in the harem. One reason they perpetuated that story was that it sold good books. People liked to read these kinds of stories. They had stereotypes in their mind, and they liked to hear the story repeated. Another reason that the stereotype went on was that the Ottoman Sultan was, at many points in time, the enemy of European powers. And so this was negative propaganda. This was a way of saying, you know, he may be powerful, but look, you know, he's not a proper ruler. He doesn't treat the women well. So a lot of people had a vested interest in keeping this story going.
Pierce says the world harem itself has several meanings, and each sheds light on its role and importance in the Ottoman Empire.
Well, this word harem has a range of meanings, one forbidden, taboo, kind of off limits to people, and one protected, guarded. I think if we think of maybe a religious space where you can't go into it unless you dress properly or you have proper behavior. So in a sense, certain kinds of behaviors are off limit. At the same time, that space is protected. So I think the two things overlap.
Other scholars are also weighing in. Molly Green is a history professor at Princeton University. She says the harem's location in the innermost section of the palace indicated just how powerful the women of the harem really were.
I think in the Ottoman organization of the world, a much more important distinction was inner and outer. And rather than being out on the street and being public is associated with power, the closer in you were to the Sultan, the closer you were to power. So even though women were confined in the harem, it doesn't mean that they didn't have power, because in fact, the inner circle is more associated with power than the outer circle.
Green adds that the women in the royal harem actually exerted political influence and often played important roles in society.
So these women were brought up to be suitable wives. They played important political roles, although from behind the walls of the harem. We know that some of the most powerful women in the harem were converts from various European countries. They were involved in diplomacy between Istanbul and their place of origin. They engaged in Islamic charity. They built mosques. They built imarets, all of those things. So they were very much conversant in the ways of a sort of Islamic charity that the aristocracy generally engaged in.
Many of the women even received political educations in the harem and were groomed for positions of power.
Only a few of these women were destined to become the consorts of the sultans, to have children with him. Those women had to have a political education. And during their training, they would watch other more powerful women in the harem be political actors. They would learn the ropes of government and what went on in the palace and what women were responsible for in terms of imperial protocol and helping to run the state, really.
In the 17th century, the mother of the sultan, who resided in the harem and was its senior administrator, began to play a pivotal role in dynastic successions.
What we do know is that the Valide Sultan, the mother of the Sultan, who became all-powerful in the 17th century, was certainly very, very involved in deciding which, of the young men was going to become a Sultan after the Sultan. So she became much more critical in the reproduction of the dynasty.
Green and Pierce agree that it will take a long time before myths of the harem will be replaced by historical accounts of it as a place where women exercised power even outside the building's walls. And scholars say letters from Lady Mary Wortley Montagu were the very first close to accurate Western account of the harem. Montagu was the wife of the British ambassador to Turkey in the 18th century. She immersed herself completely in the everyday culture of Ottoman women and wrote a detailed account of what she saw. Carrie Ederer, EbruNews.